So, there I was, barreling down the dark interstate at around 2 a.m., the headlights of my rig cutting through thick fog that had rolled in from nowhere. Driving at night was routine for me. I'd been hauling loads across the country for years, seen every kind of weird and unsettling thing you could imagine. But this night was different. I'd picked up a load in California, aiming to deliver in Colorado by sunrise. It was a long haul, but the road had always been a friend, even if a strange one at times. After all, there's something about the hum of an engine and the sight of nothing but open road stretching in front of you that can make you feel invincible. Until that night, about 2 hours into my trip, the road narrowed, twisting through a stretch of deserted forest. The GPS warned me this route could be risky, but I'd driven it before and figured I could handle it. As I rounded a sharp bend, a figure darted across the road. I hit the brakes hard, heart hammering, and barely managed to avoid hitting whatever it was. When the dust settled, I looked around. No one. Just an empty road, trees towering on both sides, silent and still. I pulled myself together, thinking maybe I'd just seen an animal, maybe a deer, but then there was something else. A noise, a whisper. Through my open window, something was whispering my name. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. I closed the window, figuring I was just tired, imagining things. But as I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows. I pushed the accelerator, eager to get out of that forest stretch. Then my truck's radio, which I had left off, crackled to life. Static filled the cabin, and underneath the static, a voice murmured just barely loud enough to hear. "Come back." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't recognize the voice, but it sounded wrong, like a mix of static and a low, gravelly growl, echoing as if it were calling from a distance. I turned off the radio completely, but the voice kept repeating, "Come back, come back," and then, just like that, the radio fell silent. I was starting to feel like this night was taking a very dark turn, but I kept pushing forward, just wanting to leave that stretch of road behind. Another hour went by, and I began to think maybe I was in the clear. The fog had cleared up, and the road was empty once more. But then, out of nowhere, my rig lurched as if I'd hit something massive. I swerved, struggling to keep control. The truck slowed to a stop, and in the glow of my headlights, I saw it. A person, lying in the middle of the road. Or at least, that's what I thought it was. I leapt out of the cab, heart pounding, and rushed over. But as I got closer, I froze. The figure didn't have a face. Where eyes, nose, and a mouth should have been, there was just smooth, blank skin stretched over bone. It lay there, motionless, its arms twisted at impossible angles. I stumbled back, suddenly aware of just how silent the night had become. No wind, no crickets, just the heavy, suffocating silence pressing in from all sides. I was about to turn and run back to my cab when a sound echoed through the trees. A low, gurgling growl, like something huge and angry was hiding in the darkness, watching. I looked back at the figure on the road, and that's when I saw it move. Not much, just a slight twitch of its fingers, but it was enough to send me scrambling back to the truck. I jumped into the driver's seat, fumbling to start the engine. The headlights caught something else moving on the side of the road. More figures, all identical, all faceless, slowly emerging from the trees. They stood there, staring, or whatever they did with those smooth faces, right at me. With a shuddering gasp, I slammed my foot down on the accelerator and peeled out of there. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty road ahead. But as I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figures following me. The figures didn't run. They didn't even walk. They just appeared, like static on a TV screen flickering closer each time I glanced back. 1 second, they'd be 50 feet behind, the next just 10. I couldn't look in the mirror anymore. I gripped the wheel, white-knuckled, heart racing, as I pushed the rig harder than I'd ever dared. The engine roared, tires screeched, but no matter how fast I drove, I felt that presence right behind me. Somehow, deep down, I knew If I looked in the mirror again, I'd see one of those faceless things inside the truck, right behind me. Reaching, the highway started twisting and turning again, winding deeper into an endless maze of black trees and shadow. My GPS had long since lost signal. The only thing guiding me now was instinct and the desperate urge to escape. Just as I felt I couldn't take it anymore, a shape loomed on the horizon. An old gas station, lights flickering. It looked deserted, but I didn't care. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the rig to a screeching halt right in front of the place. I jumped out, expecting to feel hands or whatever those things had instead of hands. Grab me, pull me down, but nothing. The air was still, the night silent. I glanced around, heart still pounding, but the road behind me was empty. No figures, no whispers, nothing. I took a few shaky steps toward the gas station, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the voice on the radio, that low, distorted growl, still echoed in my mind. As I stepped inside the gas station, I took a look around. Rows of dusty shelves were stocked with snacks that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. Behind the counter was a clerk, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't move, didn't speak. "Hey," I managed, voice shaking. "Phone. Do you have a phone?" The clerk lifted his head slowly, and my stomach dropped. His face was wrong. Too smooth, like his features had been blurred, melted together. And his eyes, small, black, bottomless pits that swallowed the light. "I'd leave if I were you," he rasped, voice crackling like dead leaves underfoot. "You're not supposed to stop here." What?" I stammered, trying to back away. "They don't like it when you stop," he said, and his mouth twisted into a grimace, teeth too sharp, too white, in the dimness. "You'd better get back in your truck and keep going. Otherwise, they'll find you." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted out of the gas station, practically diving back into the cab. As soon as I slammed the door shut, the headlights flickered on by themselves, casting their eerie glow across the empty road. Only, the road wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood directly in the beam of my headlights, just a few feet away. It had no face, just like the others, but this one was wearing an old, torn trucker's jacket, like it had once belonged to someone like me. And draped over its shoulders, barely visible in the dim light, was a chain, thick, rusty, with a padlock that looked as old as the road itself. The thing tilted its head to one side, almost curious, and then it took a step forward. My foot slammed on the gas before I could think. The truck lurched forward, headlights blazing as I barreled right toward it. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. And as I passed through it, as if it was made of mist, my whole body went ice cold, a chill that froze me to the core. The radio crackled again. "Turn back," the voice whispered, as if it was right next to my ear, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Turn back." The truck roared forward, but the road in front of me wasn't the road I remembered. The familiar twists and turns were gone. Instead, I was hurtling down a straight, narrow stretch lined with endless black trees. No landmarks, no signs, just an endless path that seemed to go on forever. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was stuck on 2:37 a.m., the digits flickering weakly. My GPS was blank, no signal, no map, just a hollow, empty screen. I tried the radio again, desperately twisting the knob, but all I got was that same low, static-laced growl. It droned on, maddening, echoing through the cab like it was trapped with me. Then headlights appeared in the distance, a massive set, like those of a semi barreling toward me at full speed. I honked the horn, flashing my lights, trying to get the other driver's attention. But the lights didn't budge. They just kept getting closer, faster, brighter. My heart pounded as I gripped the wheel, hands slick with sweat. The headlights bore down on me until they were blinding, consuming everything in their beams. I couldn't see the road. I couldn't see anything. And just as the lights reached me, I braced for the impact, and then silence. I opened my eyes, heart still racing, and realized I was parked at a rest stop. A regular, run-down, quiet rest stop. The cab was still, the headlights shining onto an empty lot surrounded by dark trees. The clock read 5:47 a.m., and a faint, grayish light crept over the horizon. Morning was coming. I sat there for a few moments, shaken, wondering if I'd dreamed the entire thing. My fingers were stiff and aching from how tightly I'd gripped the wheel. My throat was raw from shouting, but the truck was fine. Everything was fine. I was parked like I'd just pulled over for a break. In a daze, I climbed down from the cab, rubbing my eyes. I looked around the empty rest stop, trying to get my bearings. The first thing I saw was another truck parked a few spaces down. It was an old, rusted rig that looked like it hadn't moved in years. And then I saw him, a man, standing just behind the truck, staring at me. He was wearing an old, worn trucker's jacket, and across his shoulders, slung like some kind of twisted burden, was a heavy chain with a padlock. I couldn't see his face, not clearly anyway. His features were shadowed, but I could feel him staring, like his eyes were burning right into me. I turned to get back in my truck, to get away from him, but as I moved, he called out in a voice as hollow and empty as the static on my radio. "They don't like it when you stop," he said, almost a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the engine. "If you keep going, they might just let you go. But if you stop again, you'll never make it out." I climbed back into my truck, hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back. Couldn't. As I pulled out of the rest stop, I forced myself to focus on the road, to keep my eyes forward. The sun started to rise, its light breaking through the trees, washing over the road in front of me. But even as I left the rest stop behind, even as the sky turned from gray to blue, I could still feel his presence, a shadow lurking in the rearview mirror. And somewhere, in the distance, I heard a low, static-laced whisper trailing after me, like a faint echo from another world. "Turn back." I kept driving, and to this day I haven't stopped. Not at night, not in the fog, not when the whispers come through the radio, because I know that if I ever stop again, they'll be waiting. It was about midnight when I took a wrong turn off Interstate 80 somewhere in Nebraska. I'd been on the road for almost 14 hours straight, hauling my load across 3 states. Sleep wasn't an option. I had to make it to Denver by morning. I'd been through these back roads countless times, so the detour didn't bother me at first. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night was unusually still. Even the usual chirping of crickets and rustling of tree branches seemed absent. Then I noticed a dim glow in the distance, a rundown gas station, miraculously still open at this hour. I figured I'd pull over, grab a coffee, and ask for the quickest way back to the main road. When I walked in, the place was empty. No one behind the counter, no customers. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting an eerie, almost sickly glow. There was something stale in the air, the kind of staleness that hinted at secrets best left alone. "Hello," I called out, trying to break the silence. Nothing. Shrugging it off, I poured myself a cup of burnt-smelling coffee. Just as I was about to leave, a figure emerged from the back room. He was tall, skinny, with a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in decades. He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment before muttering, "Headed west?" I nodded, taking a sip from my cup, wishing I hadn't. Tasted worse than it smelled. "Stay on Route 17, he said slowly, as if each word cost him something. "And don't stop, no matter what." That got my attention. "What do you mean, don't stop?" The man didn't answer. He just gave me this haunted look and disappeared into the back. As I got back in my truck, his words stuck with me. "Don't stop." I chuckled, chalking it up to some small-town superstition. But the weirdness of the place lingered, gnawing at my mind as I merged back onto the road. It wasn't long before I saw it. A thick fog started rolling in, so dense it seemed to absorb the beams of my headlights. In the middle of nowhere, I couldn't see 10 feet in front of me. My grip tightened on the wheel as I pressed on, ignoring the instinct to slow down. Then, out of the fog, something appeared. At first, I thought it was another truck, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else. An old, battered car, creeping along in the same direction I was heading. The car's taillights flickered like they were barely holding on. It was too slow, so I pulled into the other lane to pass it. Just as I drew alongside, I glanced over and froze. Inside, the driver was slumped over, his face pale and lifeless, eyes wide open, staring straight ahead. He looked like he'd been dead for days. My heart slammed against my chest. Before I could fully process what I'd seen, my truck swerved back into the right lane, and I floored it, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and that car. But no matter how fast I went, the car stayed behind me. The headlights of that old car never faded, locked onto my truck like some hellish beacon. I kept glancing at my mirrors, hoping to lose it around a bend, but every time I checked, it was right there, close enough that I could almost feel the driver's dead eyes boring into the back of my skull. I kept replaying what the guy at the gas station had said. Don't stop. The fog seemed to thicken, clinging to the road in thick, twisting wisps. My headlights barely cut through it. At this point, all I could see was the road immediately in front of me and those relentless headlights following behind. I kept one eye on the road and one on the clock, 2:17 a.m. It was a little over an hour since I'd left the gas station. I just had to keep moving, keep my focus on Denver. Then I saw something in the road. At first, it was just a shape, low and unmoving. As I got closer, it became clear. It was a figure, hunched over on all fours. A person, crouched in the middle of the highway, head down, hair hanging limp over their face, unmoving. My foot hesitated on the brake, every instinct screaming at me to slow down. But that voice in my head repeated, "Don't stop, don't stop." So I gritted my teeth and hit the gas. I veered to the left, my tires skidding slightly as I swerved around the figure, narrowly missing it. Just as I passed, I caught a glimpse of the person's face, or what should have been a face. It was pale, blank, with hollow, empty eyes staring straight ahead, unblinking, and worse, turned ever so slowly to watch me pass. My heart hammered in my chest as I forced myself not to look back, focusing only on the road ahead. But just then, something even stranger happened. The car behind me suddenly sped up, as if it, too, was trying to avoid that figure. It swerved erratically, almost losing control, before managing to right itself. That was the first time I felt it, the bizarre sense that maybe that thing wasn't chasing me. Maybe it was trying to outrun something else. But that didn't make sense, did it? A dead driver still driving? My mind raced, trying to rationalize it all, but the fear kept me grounded. All I could do was keep my foot pressed on the gas and push forward, faster and faster, as the fog seemed to close in tighter, wrapping around the road like some kind of living, breathing thing. And then, just ahead, the fog parted, and another figure appeared, standing in the center of the road. This time, it wasn't crouched or motionless. It was upright, tall, and waiting. The figure loomed in the middle of the road, a shadowed shape with its face turned toward me. Its arms hung stiffly by its sides, fingers outstretched like claws, as though it were ready to grab onto anything that dared get close. Couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I gripped the wheel and barreled forward, the truck's engine roaring as I pressed down harder on the gas. But just before impact, the figure shifted. No, it melted. It seemed to dissolve, reforming beside my window as I flew by, gliding effortlessly with the speed of my truck. My heart stopped. His face was there, right outside my window, staring in at me. It was a man, or at least it used to be. His skin was translucent, stretched tightly over his skull, and his eyes were pure white, empty and endless. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, jaw unhinged in an expression of pure, primal terror. I felt an icy chill radiate from the glass, seeping through the window and into my bones. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. I glanced into my side mirror, half expecting him to still be there, clinging to the side of the truck. But the mirror only showed empty road behind me, winding back into the mist. Except, the headlights were gone. The car, the one that had been tailing me, had disappeared. I took a shaky breath, almost relieved, But my grip didn't relax. Something wasn't right. That car couldn't have vanished without a trace. And the fog, it was thicker than ever, swirling around me like smoke from a fire. I felt trapped, like the road was shrinking, closing in. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the roof of my truck. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving from the back of the cab toward the front. I couldn't make sense of it. There was no way anyone could be up there. We were still moving at high speed. But the sound was undeniable. A heavy, measured pace. Like someone was walking, taking their time, confident I had nowhere else to go. Then something tapped against the windshield from above. Once, twice, with a strange, rhythmic beat, like someone drumming their fingers. I barely breathed. My knuckles were white on the wheel as I kept my eyes fixed on the road, praying I'd see some sign of civilization, some light, any break in this nightmare. Then, slowly, the sound shifted. It was no longer tapping. Now, something was dragging its nails across the roof, like claws scraping against metal, inching closer and closer to the edge of the windshield. The fog was thick, blanketing the road, making every second feel like an hour. And then I saw it, emerging from the fog, stretching across the road in long, jagged letters that looked like they'd been carved into the asphalt itself. Turn back. The words stretched on for at least 50 feet, glistening wet and fresh in the darkness. But I knew those letters hadn't been there a moment ago. The scratching stopped. The air around me grew thick, almost suffocating, as if something enormous was crouched just above, waiting. I couldn't turn back now. The words "turn back" faded into my rear view as I pressed on, my hands trembling on the wheel. The silence was almost worse than the scratching had been. It felt like something was biding its time, waiting for me to make one wrong move. The fog tightened around my headlights, so dense it was like driving underwater. Every instinct screamed at me to pull over, to turn around, to do anything but keep going. But the guy at the gas station's voice rang in my head again. Don't stop, no matter what. Then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled to life. The static was loud, filling the cab with harsh white noise. I jumped, my eyes darting to the dials, but my hand froze mid-reach as something came through the static. A voice, low and strained, like it was fighting to be heard. It was my own voice. Shouldn't have come this way. My blood turned to ice. I was hearing myself, the same tone, the same exact words I'd spoken to myself just before seeing that first figure in the road. The voice continued, whispering things I'd only thought in my head, fear bubbling up with every word. You've gone too far. No turning back. My heart pounded as I struggled to ignore the radio, but the voice grew louder, overlapping, each version of my own voice layered over the other until it was like a chorus of fear. And then, they all fell silent, replaced by a single hoarse whisper. He's here. In that instant, my headlights revealed something up ahead. A figure, no, several figures, lined up along the edge of the road. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching as I drove by, their faces shrouded in shadows, but I could feel their eyes following me. One of them lifted a hand as I passed, pointing, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, each one of them turned their heads in the same direction, as if guiding me somewhere, their eyes tracking me like I was prey. I could feel the weight of their gaze, heavy and consuming, as I gripped the wheel, desperate to outrun whatever this was. I forced myself to look straight ahead, my pulse hammering, barely breathing, hoping this would end. Then the road began to twist, bending into turns that shouldn't have been there. I knew this route and it was supposed to be a straight shot, but now it was winding and narrow, and every turn felt like it was leading me deeper into some unseen trap. And that's when I saw the headlights behind me again. Only this time there were two sets. One came closer, accelerating fast, the light growing brighter, almost blinding in my mirrors. The other stayed back, as if keeping its distance, watching and waiting. My hands were slippery with sweat as I tightened my grip, the truck rumbling as I sped up. But no matter how fast I went, the headlights behind me got closer and closer, like they were chasing me, herding me forward down this cursed road. I glanced in my side mirror, And that's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a figure in the passenger seat beside me. I couldn't look directly at it, my vision fixed on the road, every instinct screaming not to acknowledge whatever was sitting there beside me. But in my peripheral vision, I saw just enough. The figure was hunched, its bony hands resting on its knees, fingers tapping a slow, deliberate beat. Its skin was gray, taut, and corpse-like, stretched over a face that was turned toward me, unblinking. Its eyes were pits of darkness, endless and consuming, and even without looking straight at it, I felt its gaze boring into me. It leaned closer, the stench of rot and damp earth filling the cab, pressing down on me. I clutched the wheel, knuckles white, struggling to keep my focus on the road. My heart raced, each beat louder than the last, thundering in my ears. The voice on the radio returned, faint but unmistakable, whispering the same words over and over. "He's here. He's here. He's here." I pressed down harder on the gas, the truck roaring as I tried to outrun the voice, the figure, the headlights chasing me. But no matter how fast I went, the road kept twisting, leading me deeper into some unknown place, the fog thickening, the turns sharper, narrower, until I barely had control. The figure beside me shifted. Slowly, it raised one skeletal hand and pointed forward, guiding me. I didn't want to look, didn't want to follow, but the road seemed to have a mind of its own, curving sharply as if steering me right where the figure wanted. And then, in the distance, I saw a bridge. It loomed out of the fog, old and decrepit, the kind of structure that looked like it hadn't seen use in decades. The wood was dark, slick with something that glistened in the fog, and the beams above it were twisted and broken, barely holding together. A shiver ran through me, but I couldn't stop. The headlights behind me flared, blinding, pushing me forward. The figure beside me whispered something, a garbled mess of words that chilled my blood. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, to understand, but it was like hearing a language from a nightmare, words that shouldn't exist. As I approached the bridge, the figure leaned in, closer than ever, so close I could feel the cold radiating off it, freezing the air between us. Its lips cracked open, and for the first time, it spoke clearly. "You can't escape. He's waiting." My pulse skittered. I could barely breathe. The bridge stretched out before me, endless and dark, a chasm below it that seemed to go on forever. I wanted to slam on the brakes, to turn around, but the figure's gaze pinned me in place, a weight that rooted me to the seat. Then, just as my front wheels hit the bridge, the headlights behind me went dark. The road behind me disappeared into the fog, swallowed whole, leaving only silence. And that's when I heard it. A low, deep growl, rumbling up from beneath the bridge. It was an animalistic sound, primal and hungry, echoing through the night like a warning. My heart hammered, my skin cold as I gripped the wheel, inching forward, barely breathing. The sound grew louder, closer, as if something was moving up from the darkness below. I risked a glance at the figure beside me, desperate for some hint of what was happening. But it was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the stench of rot lingering, but the figure had vanished without a trace. Then, with a crack, the bridge beneath me shuddered, with splintering as something massive began to move below. The bridge groaned under the weight of the truck, the wood buckling, shifting, as if something immense and alive was moving just beneath the surface. The fog thickened, swallowing the edges of the bridge and turning everything outside my windshield into a dense, suffocating wall of gray. I was trapped, caught on this ancient, crumbling bridge with nowhere to turn, no way to go but forward. And then, out of the fog ahead, I saw it. A figure tall and unnaturally thin, standing directly in the center of the bridge. Its body seemed to blend with the mist, limbs elongated and warped, twisting into unnatural angles. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just feet away from the figure. My hands were shaking as I watched it stand there, motionless. For a few moments, nothing happened. I thought maybe it was just another apparition, something that would vanish if I just blinked or looked away. But then it began to move, its head tilting, jerking toward me as if it had finally sensed my presence. It took a step forward, the wood creaking under its weight, and I saw its face for the first time. It had no eyes, just empty, hollow sockets staring into me, somehow seeing everything. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, twisted into a grotesque grin that seemed to grow larger with every step. The closer it came, the more I felt my courage drain away, replaced by a cold, numbing fear that gripped me from head to toe. The growling sound beneath the bridge grew louder, now accompanied by the splintering of wood as the structure gave way piece by piece. Whatever was down there was rising, and it felt like the whole bridge would collapse at any moment. I knew I had seconds left to decide. Somehow, I forced myself to move. I slammed the truck into reverse, trying to back up, but the bridge shuddered violently, lurching downward as the beams split and cracked. The headlights flickered, casting strange, twisting shadows across the fog, illuminating the creature just inches from my hood. Its fingers stretched out, reaching for me. With a primal scream, I threw the truck back into drive, my only choice to plow forward, straight toward the figure. The truck lurched, its wheels skidding across the splintering wood, but I kept going, pressing down on the gas with everything I had. The creature let out a shrill, inhuman scream, its mouth widening even further as I barreled straight into it. I braced for impact, but when I hit, the figure exploded into mist, vanishing as though it had never been there. The truck roared onto the other side of the bridge, but the growling below followed me, relentless. In the rearview mirror, I saw the bridge behind me collapse into the chasm, the fog closing in as planks and beams tumbled into darkness. I kept driving, not daring to stop until the fog finally thinned and the road opened up. My heart pounded as I reached a crossroads, the signs pointing toward Denver glinting under my headlights. It was over. Somehow I'd made it. But as I rolled to a stop to catch my breath, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Just a glimpse, but enough to send a cold chill down my spine. In the shadows at the edge of the road, barely visible in the dim light, was the figure. Standing there, motionless, its hollow eyes locked onto me. I didn't wait. I slammed the gas, tearing down the highway, heart racing, knowing that I'd left something back on that bridge, but something else had followed me. I never liked taking the night shifts, but as a truck driver, you don't always get a choice. You just take the load and go. That night, the dispatcher called late, saying they had a last-minute job for me. A run out to a small town in the middle of nowhere. One of those places that barely appears on a map. And yeah, it sounded a bit weird. The guy on the phone wasn't our usual dispatcher, just some low voice with too much static in the background. But it paid double and I wasn't about to turn that down. I should have turned it down. Around midnight, I was on a narrow highway, trees dense on both sides, swallowing up any light besides my headlights. The road was dead empty. Not a single car passed me in the last hour. Radio static buzzed quietly in the background, the only sound besides the hum of the engine. A good way to stay alert, I told myself. But something in the air felt wrong. The kind of feeling you get when someone's watching you, even if you're all alone. After a while, I started noticing strange signs along the road. Nothing like the usual mile 25 or no littering ones. These were old, rusted, barely hanging on their posts. I squinted as one came into view. It had no words, just a hand-painted symbol of a twisted figure. Its head was cocked to one side, its limbs longer than humanly possible. That uneasy feeling grew worse. I turned my eyes back to the road, shaking it off as just some prank from local kids. But then the radio crackled louder. Through the static, there was a faint voice, just a whisper, like someone far off. "Turn around," it said. Then, nothing. I laughed a bit, chalking it up to a prank or my own sleep-deprived mind, but I turned the volume down anyway. After about 20 minutes, I saw something in the road up ahead. A silhouette, maybe 30 yards away, walking along the edge of the highway. Just a shadow in the glow of my headlights. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. They wore a long, tattered coat and didn't seem to notice my truck barreling down behind them. It wasn't until I was practically on top of them that they finally looked up. Their face, if you could call it that, wasn't right. The features were blurred, almost melting together like a half-formed clay sculpture. Eyes too large, mouth stretched into a frozen, unnatural smile that twisted at odd angles. As I sped past, their gaze snapped to meet mine, unblinking. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I knew I should have kept driving, but I slowed down, glancing in my rearview mirror. There was no one there, just the empty road behind me. I sped up. The voice on the radio came back, crackling with static. Louder this time. "You need to leave." I pressed the power button, trying to turn it off, but the voice kept coming, scratchy and distorted. I hit the button harder. Nothing. Then, a burst of static cut through the silence, and I heard the sound of footsteps. It sounded like someone was running, bare feet slapping against cold concrete, and it was getting closer. My heart raced. I stomped on the gas, forcing my rig to go faster down that winding road. My eyes were glued to the rearview mirror, watching the empty road behind me. And then I saw it. That twisted figure was back. Not walking this time, running. Its long, distorted limbs pumped furiously, its misshapen face fixed in a grotesque grin, and it was keeping pace. I forced my eyes forward, praying that whatever it was wouldn't catch up. The radio static exploded again, deafening this time, and I heard a scream, sharp and piercing, like nails dragging across my mind. My vision blurred for a second, my grip slipping on the wheel, and the truck veered slightly before I managed to steady it. Just ahead, a shape emerged from the trees lining the road. A man, waving his arms frantically in the middle of the highway, his eyes wild with panic. I swerved, barely managing to avoid him. My brakes screeched as I brought the truck to a halt, my heart thundering in my chest. I looked out the window, but the man was gone. Nothing but the empty road stretched out before me. I told myself to keep going, just get the hell out of there. But something in me, maybe the old trucker's code of helping others, made me check the side mirror again. And there he was, the man standing just behind my truck, staring up at my window. His eyes were wide, mouth gaping open as if he were silently screaming. I didn't dare get out. I just stared back at him, feeling my skin prickle with cold dread. He took a step forward, his hand reaching up to the door handle. I floored it. The truck roared as it leapt forward, leaving that figure behind in the swirling dust. I didn't look back, not once. I just drove, faster than I ever had, the trees blurring past as the road stretched out in front of me. Hours later, I finally saw the lights of a gas station, a sign of life. I pulled in, barely able to keep my hands steady as I climbed out of the cab. The attendant looked at me, eyes narrowing as he took in my pale face and trembling hands. "You all right, buddy?" he asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but I couldn't find the words. How could I explain what had happened? Then I glanced at the window of the gas station and froze. There, reflected in the glass, was that figure, standing just behind me, its twisted face smiling back at me through the night. I stumbled back, blinking hard, praying that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But there it was, clear as day in the reflection. A contorted figure with that wide, unnatural grin, lurking in the shadows just beyond the gas station's glow. I whipped around to face it, fists clenched, ready to defend myself. But there was nothing there, just the dark, empty road stretching back into the woods. The gas station attendant tilted his head, watching me with concern. "You sure you're okay, man?" I took a shaky breath, wiping sweat off my forehead. Yeah, I just thought I saw something. Long haul, huh?" he said, not convinced. "Need a coffee? Bathroom?" I nodded, feeling stupid for letting some hallucination shake me up this much. "Yeah, coffee, please." Inside, the fluorescent lights were harsh, casting everything in a sickly white glow. The place was silent. No music, no hum of fridges, just that thick, uncomfortable quiet. I moved to the counter, drumming my fingers while the guy poured me a cup. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, scanning the glass doors to make sure I was still alone. As the attendant handed over the coffee, I felt an overwhelming urge to just talk to someone, to explain what I'd seen, to ask if he'd ever experienced anything like it on this highway. But before I could say a word, I noticed something odd on the guy's arm. It was a tattoo right above his wrist,